And our Doug is a professor who has graduate work at Duke and a number of German universities. And we welcome them both, and we look forward to their presentation on this topic this morning. And I wanted to make sure that you knew that the program was being recorded and will be available for later viewing. So without further ado, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Obviously, our pleasure to be with you this morning, even though we are still adjusting to this new being with everyone virtually. And yeah, we will try to keep things within a 45-minute time frame because there is the, of course, the important congregational meeting afterwards. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slides that Doug and I have worked on, and we'll kind of tag team back and forth with some of our material we're presenting and some of the moments for questions and conversation as well. So let me do some sharing. All right. Can everyone see the slide there?
Yes.
Excellent. So Doug, is this the title we settled on? We've been going back and forth for 12 months now.
We had agreed to do Bethel U about a year ago, and we met, I remember meeting at Little Joy Coffee House a week before everything closed down. And and I think this was even a title that we had a year ago. We thought that there were some deep divisions and furious disagreements a year ago, and that has not changed. So I think we have not yet become obsolete.
Yes, the timeless of the topic appears to be a topic for all times.
Yes.
At least in the immediate future. Let's see. All right. There we go. So just by way of introduction, we're going to be talking about polarization and division in our society, primarily political, but also within the church. And Doug and I decided to use this idea, this word engagement. It's kind of a framing metaphor, something we're going to return to in various moments throughout the morning, because we often talk about this idea of political engagement, sort of engaged voters, engaged partisans, all that kind of stuff. People are engaged in the life of Bethel. But we thought it'd be interesting to kind of press this and actually go to the meaning, and we hear a lot of related to weddings and relationships in this period where you're in love with your beloved and you're handing out rings in front of famous monuments. At least I guess maybe now there's less of that. Maybe now it's just rings over Zoom. But this idea of a romantic relationship perhaps is a metaphor for political and religious ones. So Doug's going to start us off with a little bit of where we are now politically.
Yeah, I mean, I really loved, it was Anthony who thought of the term engagement and using it in a different way. Political scientists, of course, talk about engagement all the time, and political engagement is how much we are reading the news, how much we are talking about the news, how much we are discussing and arguing about the news with our family and friends and neighbors. And one would say that we have been more engaged than ever in politics in the last decade, that Americans are more politically aware and politically affiliated than they have been in the past. Yet, of course, that sort of affiliation, that connection has led to deep, deep divisions. As you well know, you don't have to be told the way about the way in which we are distinguished from each other. But there is a lot of division and disagreement. We were even talking before everyone came about the division and disagreement within families. There are ways in which we have separated ourselves off from others. And of course, there's division and disagreement that expresses itself in all sorts of institutions and sectors of our society, including our church. And so Anthony and I were wondering about ways in which we could respond to this division and disagreement. And I have to admit, and when we were speaking, I leaned toward this desire to make everything okay, right? To make the division disappear somehow. And appeal to the idea of harmony or consensus or civility, that I want our conversations to be open and fair and to be able to talk with people who I disagree with. And so I sometimes lean toward appealing to civility.
But on the other side, there is also sometimes a drive for purity in terms of political and moral positions. The sense that civility is just going to get in the way or seem to present kind of a half-hearted middle ground when the issues are really important and really fraught. And so while Doug leans towards civility, I would say that I lean more towards the kind of what we're calling purity in this sense. Instead of making it all nice so we get along or following certain sort of clear procedures and rules. How do we demand accountability, demand responsibility, and enforce that in ways that are often can feel antagonistic and can feel divisive in our society?
So what do you think, Anthony? Should we break up into groups?
Yeah, that might be, we have a good enough crowd.
We were wondering whether, so if Darlene, if you could start putting us into smaller groups, maybe.
How many groups do you want? There are 30 screens right now.
Oh, so maybe 3 or 4 people together.
Okay, so
No one feels on the spot, but it's small enough that people can speak.
okay.
Is it 3? So maybe 10.
Yeah, and for how long?
Oh, really quickly.
5 minutes.
Okay.
3,
So you may not get any warning. I'll just have to bring you back because I don't know about setting the time here. But what do you want to give some instructions before I send you out?
Great. Anthony just put on the chat 3 questions that we want you to talk about. So we talked about these sort of sides or approaches to division that people have. The desire for harmony or civility, or the desire for principled purity or principled resistance to what is wrong. And we want you to think about where you might fall between those 2 options. And then, does it depend on the topic, or do you notice a tendency or a disposition in yourself? And if you do lean in one direction, what worries you about the other side?
Okay.
So we're all back.
Okay. Wrong one. All right. Can everyone see my screen again?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Charge of clicking buttons. Okay. All right. So Doug, you're back.
Okay. So one of the things we actually talked about is this sort of way in which I and lots of folks lean toward wanting to appeal to civility. And we sort of in our group, we came upon actually that there are some dangers in appealing to civility when you face issues of real moral import. And the danger is that it can paper over conflict, say everything is okay, and assume a type of consensus and harmony where it just might not exist. Maybe there is a real moral and political difference that needs to be highlighted and clarified. And civility language or harmony language can sort of blur things. And do you want me to, and then the appeal to purity also has its danger, of course. It can entrench conflict by dividing community in sort of to the righteous people and the unrighteous people. Sometimes this is true, but sometimes this is actually, it asserts a type of righteousness that doesn't really fit with the facts on the ground and the opinions or positions of people who we think we are in deep disagreement with. And so purity can entrench difference where it might not exist.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add, this is one of those tricky things today I see with this language of cancel culture. You've probably seen that in the news and on various stories. I find the idea very problematic. I'm not signing up for this idea that there is a thing called cancel culture, but to the point that some people do act in ways that divide and automatically judge somebody as righteous or unrighteous. I think that certainly is a tendency we see. How prevalent it is, who's doing it, when and where is another question. But there certainly can be this desire to see the other side as evil and your side is good on a variety of issues.
And a weird irony is that sometimes the language of counterculture or cancel culture itself is used to assert purity and attack your opponent, right? You are for counterculture or for cancel culture. I am going to reject you, right? Okay, so we both thought that as we talked about these dispositions toward civility and purity, we realized that they both really can result in the same sort of thing, and that is a disengagement from politics. In different ways, the alternatives involved, so civility or purity, lead to a type of disengagement, right? When we are simply asserting civility, consensus, harmony, let's not talk about things that make us uncomfortable, that can sort of lead to disengagement. We then actually don't talk about or face up to situations or relationships or policy issues that are by their very definition full of conflict. And of course, purity also can lead us toward disengagement. We don't have to engage with those people who make us uncomfortable or who are saying things that are we disagree with. We'll just sort of present them as impure and withdraw. So both civility and purity approaches can lead to a type of disengagement. Oh, I was going to say just a little bit of background on why there might be increased disengagement in the United States. A lot of this might be reviewed, so I'm going to zip through this. So one of the things, a journalist named Bill Bishop wrote this great book called The Big Sort, in which he describes what's been happening over the last decades. And one of those is that we've been sorted into sort of social identities, social groups that are really divergent over the last actually just 10 or 15 years. And this is a view of the landslide counties in the 2020 presidential election. The dark blue and dark red are those counties that were voted overwhelmingly Democrat or Republican during the 2020 presidential election. Here we can see this real divergent between rural areas and urban areas. And if you click on the next slide, we can see sort of the way in which that's happened over the last couple decades. There have been increased landslide counties in the United States during these presidential elections. You can see how they've been more and more. And part of this is a story about geography. Rural areas have become more and more Republican, and urban areas have become more and more Democrat. There's another. The next slide says about the same thing. This is more evidence of how this has happened all over the place, right? Not only in the rural and the urban areas, but also in the suburbs. There is this move toward sorting us. Okay, the next slide. And there's a lot of things that have happened. One of the stories is that there's a real difference between the rural and the urban in the United States, and it's becoming more and more emphatically expressed. Another thing that's really important is that our own cross-cutting memberships have declined, and that's a political sciencey term to describe those types of memberships we might have in the Rotary Club or Bethel Church or the bowling club we might be in which we engage with members of other people who have really different political ideas. And what is happening is those memberships are declining across the board in general, but also when we do join civic groups, they usually are sorted more, so that we have very few interactions with people who think really differently than us. Compounding that big sort is the tendency of political elites to be more adept at advertising their parties and creating party brands. And we can see this even like, Apple doesn't sell us computers anymore. They sell us a sort of a personal identity of what it's like to be an Apple computer owner, right? Party elites are really good at this as well. They are signaling identity instead of promoting political policies, right? If you're a Democrat, you are not a Republican, or if you're a Republican, you're really not like one of those Democrats. And instead of talking about particular issues like gun safety, there is a lot of emphasis on identity, and social media and media then compound this by offering us really distinct and insulated sources of information. So what's happening is this radical sorting of people. And if you click again, Anthony, we can see that a new type of partisanship is emerging in the United States, not based on social identity. And this is not new to you, but it's something that's happened over the last decades, that liberals, secular, urban, young, Hispanic, Black folks are almost all Democrats. You can assume how people will vote if you know about their demographics. The same thing goes for conservative, church-going, rural, working class whites. So that we can even know about someone's political affiliation just by knowing just one or two things about who they are, about what they, and that partisanship is more and more emphatic. And I have several books down below that explain the same thing. Now, one response could be, well, so what? We just disagree. There are important disagreements that are being articulated through these various parties, and that's really important. There's some really interesting psychological research about in-group, out-group divisions, and I'll just go through really quickly. In 1971, Henry Teifel, this Polish British psychologist, did an experiment where he just asked people to estimate how many dots are in this picture. And they did these estimations. And then he brought everybody back and said, oh, you're part of the overestimator group, or you're part of the underestimator group. And what he found after that was really interesting, that once people were divided into overestimators and underestimators, they would do all sorts of wild things about assuming that other people who are also overestimators would be smarter or be more thoughtful. Even when they offered these people money, can you distribute money now to overestimators and underestimators? They would say, I want people in my group to get more money, even if I get less. So there's this weird favoritism and bias that emerges even with arbitrary divisions, when we are divided up into overestimators and underestimators, which clearly doesn't matter, but they will reinforce a sort of in-group and out-group bias. And if that's combined with the big sort, it seems to me that we should expect in-group and out-group bias to emerge in our neighborhoods, our churches, our organizations, and our political parties.
Huh.
And then the next, and so what's the problem with this sort of in-group and out-group bias? It seems to me that there's a way in which defining ourselves by social identity all over and over again can be, well, first, an obstacle to interacting with those people who might challenge us, right? It's also an obstacle to really listening to other people. We think we know what people think before they speak because we have all of these patterned signs that can tell us, oh, I know that you're one of us, or I know that you're an opponent, right? And one of the things that people have found, or political scientists have found really interesting, is that this way of this big sort in the social identity distinctions can obscure the many ways we might agree. A great article, Greg Walter just sent me an op-ed from the New York Times about the way in which political elites are dividing us up, constantly telling us we have disagreements that we might not actually have in practice. And so one great example is gun safety laws. Most Americans are in favor of some sort of gun safety laws, but political elites are constantly reminding us of our partisan divisions and our partisan differences and not to trust the other side. And they have successfully undermined any efforts for the popular will to be expressed through representative democracy. Oh, one more thing that I just wanted to talk about. This is an experiment by Dunning and Kruger. Maybe some of you know about it. They've found that the more we know, the less confident we become, and the less we know, the more confident we become. And this is sort of the graph that as soon as, if you know absolutely nothing about something, you might stay quiet. But if you read one op-ed or see one Facebook post or something, you might think that you know more, and you will certainly be more willing to opine about a particular topic. But as you learn more, you will become a little bit more humble. So there's a sort of a strange arc of unwarranted confidence in most of us. And they found that people with higher IQs and more professional success are more apt to fall for this sort of to be standing on Mount Stupid when they talk about things they don't know about, right? And it seems to me that our politics and this big sort can exacerbate the Dunning-Kruger effect. An outrage industry that makes money by framing complex issues as issues that we should be outraged about, and can force us to be more and more partisan, and, well, make us all stand on top of that Mount Stupid, asserting that we are confident about things that we really don't yet know much about. And so there's just sort of an example. Maybe you've experienced others standing on Mount Stupid.
This is one we grabbed last year as a transition from impeachment trial to COVID response was ramping up. I'm sure now we could place it with vaccine knowledge or insert other things here. Excellent. All right. So we're going to shift just a little bit from the political to the religious. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about what I think are some tendencies or some resources in our Lutheran heritage for thinking about how we relate to one another and how we approach some of these issues of polarization and sort of the factionalizing of our communities here. Get a little bit off here. So one thing I just want to highlight is that in the Lutheran tradition, we stand with Luther in a longer sort of, I'll call Augustinian tradition. This goes back to a bishop in North Africa, a guy named Augustine, who lived in a town called Hippo. He was usually seen as having kind of a dark view of the world, kind of a negative view of sin and people. But I think there's some good resources here. One thing that I point to here is that Augustine always had this sense, and Luther as well, that whatever good gifts we have, whatever good things we're capable of doing, like coming together as a church or coming together in political groups, can always be used or abused, and often will be, even by well-meaning, good-intending people. There's just something about the sinfulness of humanity that's always going to set us up for potential corruption. Doesn't mean everything that we do is corrupt, but it gives us maybe a little bit of humility, a little bit of pause in how we do things. One of the things that Augustine and others focused on is that we often love things in the wrong ways. And this is one of the sources of one of the ways that our sin expresses itself. So this idea that sin isn't necessarily a bad existing thing out there, but it's sort of our constant turning away from better things to worse things. And so for Augustine, there's always going to be this emphasis on what happens when we turn away from love of God to try and love ourselves or love other people without God. His sense that we always sort of want to use people or use things around us in ways that are harmful. This at least is the way that he saw his own life sort of developing and devolving. One of the ways that Augustine talks about this in one of his big books called The Confessions, where he's literally just sort of going through and narrating what he thinks are the failures of his life for about 10 chapters before slightly switching topics, is he talks about how, in his youth as a teenager, he engaged in this rather petty crime of stealing pears off a pear tree. And he emphasizes that he didn't really do it because they were good pears. He wasn't hungry. He didn't have some sort of mitigating reason. He just enjoyed doing it for doing something bad. The sort of forbidden fruit kind of tendency in us. And Augustine thinks this is pretty peculiar. There would be creatures out there like us who would do things just for doing something, the thrill of doing something wrong. But as I sort of look at our political landscape, there does seem to be, at least even in me sometimes, this desire to want to rebel just for the sake of rebelling. And I heard people sort of gathering on the Capitol steps back in January and folks afterwards. You get this sense of people doing things that they think they wouldn't do alone, but once there's a crowd engaged in it, once there's this group supporting you and behind you, suddenly you're on board for what is objectively and clearly a bad idea. So Augustine had this experience in his life, and I think we see it replicated, whether it's stealing pears or charging into government buildings. Augustine also thought that his family and his community were always pushing him and encouraging him to put his career before anything else. And so he sacrificed certain relationships with the woman he loved, with his child in some ways. He had a son, and certainly with God. Not because he thought his career was more important, but it often took priority. So he's trying to hold on to this idea that, of course, I'm a good Christian or I'm a good person, but when the chips are down, he often chose furthering his own economic and career aspirations over other things. And so just these little subtle ways that we sort of convince ourselves that I'm pursuing something good, like getting a job, pursuing a career, but then somehow we notice that we've lost all kinds of things that might have put the career in better perspective. And Augustine even thinks that friendships can go wrong in this way. So he has this rather poignant passage where he is sobbing over the loss of a friend. He's grieving deeply, discussing what we probably describe as sort of clinical depression in the midst of this. But he sort of berates himself for it, or he seems to be judging himself for it. And it turns out he's not judging himself because he experienced emotions and because he was sad that his friend had died. But he's sad, or he senses that he loved his friend too much or in the wrong sort of way. And for him, that means that he was never prepared for his friend to die. He was never prepared to lose his friend. There was something about him wanting to hold on to this person permanently and not let go of something and kind of adapt and move and recognize sort of the contingency of life and the fact that people live and die. So again, he was holding on to something good, a friendship, a lost love, but holding on into a way that ended up, he felt, sort of corrupting his response and bringing him to a place he didn't need to go. Additionally, Augustine was pretty harsh on the role of the Roman government, but governments in general. He thinks we often talk of the virtue of our government. The peace of Rome was his issue. We might say today what democracy and freedom and all the things the United States hands out and believes in and puts on bumper stickers and cars. But Augustine's always going to be really suspicious of this, to the point that he says that often all of this is just a mask, different language we use, things we put on to cover up a desire to dominate in different and new ways. So taking this to Luther, right, we get this idea in Luther of the simulus et peccator, the simultaneously justified and sinner and saint, and all the ways that gets parsed out in our Lutheran slogans. But I think this is important when we think about our political life. Right? If we think of ourselves and others around us as simultaneously righteous and unrighteous, and ourselves as well, we're going to be real nervous about people wanting to convince us that civility is always the case. People are always good, give them the benefit of the doubt, always be charitable in every instance, or that sort of purity is good. And so Luther often chastised people who wanted to make Christ's teachings in the gospel be the way we live our government and run our lives. Because he said, first make the world Christian, and then you can do that. But in the meantime, what we have are the people you see around you on this screen, a mix of sinner and saints in each of us. I'm not sort of pointing to certain screens as being sinners and saints. We can do that later in our free time, I suppose. Yes. Doug volunteers. And one of the things that Luther talked about, and this is a phrase of his that I use all the time because I love it, He talked about what we do in this life, as he says, crawling after heroes. And this is his advice about political leadership and political engagement. And I just love this. In some ways, it's sort of depressing because crawling, I mean, hurts my knees, even in my middle age. I imagine that's not going to get better as I keep aging. So this idea of sort of crawling around and moving slowly in the muck and the mud or all that kind of stuff doesn't seem terribly positive or optimistic. I've never seen a political campaign say we're going to like crawl slowly and make mild progress. It doesn't really get folks to come out to a rally. But for Luther, this is the best we can hope for. But I think it's still something, right? He's not giving up on the fact that there's progress, not giving up on the fact that political structures and social structures can do good. He's just sort of saying, listen, this is going to be a long slog, and we're not going to get there quickly or ever completely in this life. So in some ways, Luther's example, I think, was a living example of what it means to engage politically. Luther, we often celebrate as this guy who really shook up both religious and political structures in his day. And I even have a t-shirt with his image on it because I sort of like it so much. Mm-hmm. And Luther, throughout his life, was engaged in political writing. He's always writing these letters and treatises about leaders and to leaders on all kinds of things. Who's getting married to whom, how much money is being given to the miners in this town or not. So he was always engaged politically in important ways, right? Pushing for the maintenance of common chests. So people would collect money, churches would collect money, and make sure it was distributed to those in need. And they wouldn't sort of be shamed for asking for need. This would be kept sort of private and held by the pastors or folks on the town council. But they would give away sort of freely and generously and not try and hold on to this money for their own purposes. But at the same time, Luther was also a highly suspicious person in his life. So while he preaches and teaches about serving the neighbor, he often was very suspicious of his neighbors, particularly if his neighbors said something that didn't sound like the thing that he was saying. And over the course of his life, he became more and more convinced that those who had different ideas about other things like communion or baptism were just the Pope's enemies again, or the devil's minions sort of coming after him. And then he would use language that you probably would see today as well on Facebook feeds or on Reddit subposts, the kind of language I won't repeat in a Sunday's adult ed session, in a way that, again, I think was a medieval example of partisanship and a medieval example of demonizing your opponents in that sense that you are pure and your enemy is impure. But positively as a resource, if you remember Luther's Freedom of a Christian, he talks about lots of things, commands and promises, faith and good works. But when he talks about the power of faith and what faith does in our lives, and he shifts to discussing Christ, he borrows this image of marriage. Right? And the idea that Christ is our bridegroom, and we're the bride, or I chose two brides here because this picture is just fabulous. I don't look nearly as good in any of my wedding pictures, so I chose a much better example. And so you have here two people who are binding their lives together, sort of focused on each other and sharing all kinds of things. And this is what Luther thinks Christ's life with us is like. Christ gives us all of these gifts that are God's to give, sort of the hope, the confidence, the faith, the trust that we need to be better with God and better with each other. And Christ also takes from us all of the debt that you brought into your marriage. I'm not going to make any judgments about where you are, but sometimes you come into marriage with some baggage. It could be financial. It certainly is emotional. And the idea is that Christ takes this from us and sort of takes these burdens off our shoulders and helps us hold them and shares them and holds them in common. And so I think there's real value here in thinking about all of our relationships in this way and sort of spinning this metaphor out. How are we sharing gifts? How are we sharing burdens? If we're going to be in relationship, that's going to be a condition of being in relationship. So we're going to do more breakout groups, but I wonder if we can just do this in a larger group for the sake of time. And just a couple of folks, if folks are willing to share, I'm just curious to hear, if you think about this metaphor of engagement and of being wedded or being in a long-term committed relationship of some kind, how have you tried to navigate sort of the conflicts that arise, that come up? What ways did you find to work through some of this? Both the gifts and the debts and the burdens.
I wasn't shouting.
What's that, Dottie?
I said it wasn't with shouting.
Did you try shouting? You just put it out there. Okay. So shouting was a dead end in discussing one's married or committed relationship life.
I've always thought that marriage makes you learn more about who you are too, insofar as, or at least for me, it's been like I had this vision of what an awesome, kind, gentle, generous person I am. And marriage can sort of put the mirror up and you realize, oh, there are a lot of days where I'm none of those things. And that is really helpful in understanding sort of how to move away from sort of making everything harmonious and beautiful and actually listening to people who you are hurting.
Anyone tried the make things harmonious and just kind of keep quiet strategy?
Oh, yes. Sometimes we just have to agree to disagree on
Yes.
some things,
Yeah.
you know, and then we don't talk about certain issues.
I mean, it sounds like you're selective in that though, right? There's sometimes you do that.
Yes, and it depends on how close the relationship is, you know, but I have somebody who's like a sister to me, and we had to come to the point where we agreed to disagree. And so we don't talk politics, for instance. We talk about a lot of other things, but, you know.
That's always a funny phrase, agree to disagree, right? So you already know that you disagree. You're sort of
Yeah.
agreeing to keep together and sort of keep going,
Yeah,
even though you recognize that your positions aren't changing anytime soon.
right.
Often when I've used that phrase, it's been because I just don't want to talk anymore. So it's less of a sort of a noble, let's keep together in relationship amidst our disagreement. And it's more, I'm just tired of this and I want to go to a different room or a different space or not be on the phone with this person anymore.
Oh,
All right, I need to move forward just because you put two professors who put too many things into presentations together. So it's sort of a magnified effect. So I'm going to kick it back to Doug for a few minutes. We're going to just talk about some different ways of understanding our political relationships that might be helpful in these times.
I really like the way Anthony is talking about sort of conflict within commitment. You know, we were trying to sort of, you lean away from conflict by either asserting harmony when it doesn't exist, or by asserting that the other side is so terrible you don't want to engage with them. But engagement seems to involve conflict. I don't know about you, my engagement was the time where I had the most fights with Katie. And that was a time where you're like sorting out all sorts of really important things. And so engagement is going to be part of conflict. So one of the things to do is to think about sort of how you can have conflict within commitment. And one of the political scientists who I find really interesting is at Columbia, and he has this lab called the Difficult Conversations Lab, where you go in and you talk about really impossible things with strangers. So you talk about gun control or abortion or I don't know, anything in politics these days, and then they ask you to sign some sort of common commitment statement at the end. And they find that oftentimes people have a really hard time coming to any sort of common commitment consentment with strangers. And so he worked these two things that I think are really interesting. One of the ways he prepped people for their conversations is he gave them articles that express sort of like the both sides of various arguments, right? And then he had them enter into conversations and see if they were able to produce these common commitment statements. And they had a really hard time doing that. And then he rewrote the article as not a us versus them, there are two sides to this issue, or these are the best arguments on both sides. Instead, sort of rewrote the article as a difficult problem that had to be solved. And when people read that article, they had a much better chance of being able to produce these sort of common commitment statements at the end. And Peter Coleman talks a lot about binary bias. And then maybe this is another problem that we might have in our politics that is always sorting us into two groups, that we have this binary bias. So we have to figure out which side we're on and which identity we have before we face up to really complex problems, and perhaps approaching sort of issues, violence in our society as sort of this complex and multi-dimensional problem that could be addressed not within a binary, but as an issue that we can solve together, and that maybe that might be a helpful way to interact with our neighbors politically. Just really quickly, this leads me to a sort of a division between political scientists divide different ways of thinking about democracy. Our democracy is generally built on the aggregative model that aggregates interests. The assumption is that everybody has these fixed, permanent preferences and interests, and then we're going to allocate power by everyone voting, expressing their interests. There are different ways to think about democracy, and one of them is a deliberative model that assumes that we are not people with fixed interests, but actually we are people who are constantly changing, or maybe Luther would want to say we are crawling, right? And insofar as we are all crawling together, we might have changing interests. And our politics is not something that just aggregates our interests or asserts our interests, but actually allows us to clarify and maybe even transform our interests and preferences through ongoing exchanges with all sorts of people. And it doesn't end in one final moment of decision where we decide who has power and who doesn't have power, but it's this constant and ongoing process of trying to transform and clarify those preferences. And so that's a deliberative model, which to me, I think fits more clearly within the type of anthropology that Anthony was talking about, the Lutheran view of engaging with other people, than this model that we normally have in the United States, which sort of assumes that we are these atomized beings with fixed interests. All right, Anthony.
All right, we got about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to just go through a couple quick points, and we're going to end with a question for you to sort of think about as you transition into the congregational meeting, but also beyond, just to sort of hold on to. So as Doug's talking about these deliberative model, one of the important pieces of our democratic system also are these mediating structures. As he was saying at the top of the hour, right, bowling alleys, clubs, all these kinds of places where we engage different people. And to me, that really connects with Luther's idea of different estates. By that, I mean, the church is one of these places where we ought to engage in deliberation. And it's one of these places where we practice being in relationship with each other, disagreeing with each other, finding healthy ways to express or withhold that disagreement as the situation calls for. With our families, that picture from back in the day when we used to be in the church, Norwegian sweater on there. It's very warm just looking at it. I stole this one from Facebook. I didn't tell Doug. Here you go. This is your family. I assume it's your family.
Yes.
You've put up the picture from the picture frame. And then the economy is a sort of part of family for Luther as well. So it's not just political, but it's church structures, what we do with our money, what we do with those who we love and are related to in various ways. But all of these are actually, can be seen as spaces where we're being trained in how to have conflicts and how to negotiate and how to be engaged with one another in different ways. And that we lose sight of the point of the church if we lose sight of the rich resource it is in terms of opportunities to actually be angry at somebody and know that you still love them in Christ, and vice versa. And this is a real challenge for churches to sort of work through sometimes. So I would just say that we can see these various mediating structures as places, not where we just gather and relate to escape the political or escape the economic, but to see these as the places where we are trained to manage disagreement and conflict, knowing we're bound together. This might change our understanding of love, as we're both responding to things that we value, but also learning to value new things. We're seeing that power is always operative. Power isn't just something that politicians do. It happens in the church all the time. Doug and I are exercising power right now by virtue of the fact that we get to be in charge of the Zoom conversation, and we have degrees, and this is just a way that life goes. So talking about that, talking about how we use power in better and worse ways, and getting beyond the political as the thing that Bethel does every couple of years, and we let a bunch of people into the church to set up little booths and let us record our votes. But instead to see the political sort of all over the place and how we're living our lives together, and to name it as such, to say this is political, and to resist the desire to let the partisans tell us what politics counts as, and say, no, we want to count all of these things as political. So what I'll say is we tend to fix our gaze on particular moments in these various processes. We tend to fix our gaze on elections or on what's happening in the Capitol on January 6th and all that kind of stuff. But if we are people who live in the sort of the symbol that Luther has of the both sinners and saints at the same time, I think our fixing on these moments misses the fact that this is really more of a dance, just like this wedding dance going on here. This picture, of course, is just one frozen moment in what I assume to be a really awesome dance party, people partying, and then there's confetti and all that kind of stuff. So to see the political in our lives together in the church as well as this ongoing dance, we might fix our gaze upon individual moments, but to see all these moments as connected and kind of fluid and flowing into each other, and not to sort of isolate one from the other. So the questions we'll leave you with is to think about moments in our life at Bethel where we have managed conflict and disagreement well or poorly, and what differences there are in those examples, what those different moments said or spoke to or captured for us, and how we might focus more on the good and hopefully let go of some of the less than stellar moments. All right, so I'm going to, hold on a second, try to manage all my windows simultaneously. I don't actually know how to make the screen sharing stop now. Let's see. There it is. Okay. And I'm going to cut and paste those into the chat. I saw some people trying to scribble feverishly. So there we go. And cut and paste to your delight. So those are questions for us to think about. Again, not just today, but going forward. Doug and I thought these would be useful questions for framing how we respond to polarization in the political world by thinking about how we respond in more mundane ways, just as a church in our relationship together, and to see if that would be a good resource for re-engaging the political with the resources we gain here together. Doug, do you have any closing words before we let people go?
I think not. I mean, I think what we want to leave you with is this: we might have tendencies toward overemphasizing civility or overemphasizing purity, but what we really want to leave you with is this idea that the church offers us something different, and that is a way of engaging with each other and really disagreeing with each other honestly and having conflict within the context of love. And that is a hard thing to learn, but if it's a place, or the church is the place to learn it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. Let me see.
And we'll do some palms to sort of
Yeah.
transition.
Thank you. Happy Palm Sunday.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
See
Thank
you
you.
all at the meeting.